We'll be able to host Miss Esther Rantzen here. Esther was the presenter of the incredibly popular BBC show That's Life, and following that, Esther. She's also one of the UK's leading campaigners for child rights, having set up ChildLine. In 2006, she was awarded a CVE for her work with children's causes, and in the 2010 general election, she stood as a candidate for Parliament in Luton South. So without further ado, please put your hands together for Esther Rantzen.
So they said to me, do you like to sit down or stand up? And I said, I prefer to sit down, but unfortunately, I'm rather short. And also, these springs are rather vulnerable. So when I sit down, I disappear, do I?
I can see you.
There would be a way. Are these valuable?
I don't know, Lauren.
Yes, but they can be moved.
Well, if I sat on the edge, then I'd be able to see you a bit, which pleases me. How's that? Is that okay? Can we see each other? Can we hear each other? Well, I can't hear you, but I will. Right, so you want me to finish how soon?
Take as long as you like.
About an hour? Can all our bladders stand that? That question is really directed at people of my age, and there aren't all that number of people at my age around, so anyway. Because that's one of the changes with age. People don't tell you what happens when you get older, but there are certain... Hi. Technically, I'm in the wrong place. Think to look at me that I started my BBC career as a sound engineer. So therefore I ought to know about being on mic. Am I on mic? Yeah, very good. I was asking the President, Madam President, what you would like to know. And if I'm talking for about an hour in all, what I suggest I do is ramble for about 20 minutes. And then the bit that I will enjoy much more is if you ask me questions about anything, either to do with what I've discussed or not. Anything. So I was reminiscing actually about the first time I was here when this man was President of the Union, Peter Bazalgette. I don't know if any of you were present in this debate, were you? And I gather he was a star. Well, he was certainly a star when I was here listening to him debate. And I nicked him. And I nicked him so that he could become a researcher on the program I made called That's Life. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. 3 nods. Once upon a time, back in the dawn of time, in 1968, who was born alive in 1960, forget it. So, thank you. In 1968, I was 28, and I had been working as a researcher in the BBC. A job I got with difficulty. It's never been easy to get into broadcasting, ever, and it still isn't. And I was recruited from Oxford. From Oxford, where I did quite a lot of theatre and student journalism, into BBC Radio as a sound effects girl. And if you had an umbrella, which we haven't because the weather's too good, I could show you one of my most creative contributions, which was the sound of a swooping pterodactyl. Should you be required to make that sound, what you do is run around at some speed, opening and shutting an umbrella, okay? And the great thing about that sound effect is there aren't a lot of people around who can contradict you. So the other thing, there was a radio soap called Mrs. Dale's Diary, and I played her teacups. And there was a production of Romeo and Juliet with Dame Edith Evans as the nurse, and I played Juliet. Sadly, I only played Juliet after death, because I fell to the ground. And indeed, that was why I left the radio, because on one drama, somebody had a skating accident in the distance, and I thought that if you had a distant escaping accident, all you'd hear would be a distant scream, but the producer decided that you would also hear the sound of a falling body, and it was my body that fell. And it fell 8 times onto a piece of quite polished wood until I made the sound that she thought was right of flesh hitting ice. And I limped up to the office in Broadcasting House and resigned in triplicate. And my boss said, "You need only have done it once, Esther," which is the story of my life. Anyway, so I resigned, and I was unemployed then for 6 months. And it's horrible. It is horrible. And I discovered that it is possible to spend 24 hours a day in bed. And the only reason I got out of bed was to sign on at the local, what I suppose would now be called the job centre. And then I did something I commend to you. I pulled a string. Somebody who was at Oxford the same time as me, knew my work in Oxford Theatre, and his mother was quite important in the BBC, and he suggested that I write to her, and I did. Her name was Joanna Spicer, and in those days, her unofficial job, self-appointed, I don't think the BBC knew she was doing it, was recruiting women into an entirely male-dominated organisation. And she brought them in at all kinds of levels, but me, she got in as a clerk. And I became a clerk in her department, which was programme planning. But once you're in, and I heard that Ned Sherrin was looking for a researcher. Now, Ned Sherrin was the Richard Curtis of his day. He wasn't quite the writer Richard Curtis is, but he was an are you
I'm right.
choking? Has anyone got any water?
No, it's all right, I'm all right, I'll be all right.
I've got some water. So he created something on television called satire. Satire had not been seen on television at all up to that point. Politicians, current affairs were treated with respect and reverence. A typical question put to a government minister was, "Is there anything you would like to tell the audience, Minister, Secretary of State?" And he had a completely different view, entirely irreverent. And I joined the last programme he made as a researcher. And from there, I became a researcher on another late night show, these were all late night shows, which was a late night consumer programme made by a Canadian called Bernard Braden. And for that show, I was a reporter. Now, could you stick your hands up if you're interested in a career in the media? Is anyone interested in being a reporter? Because what I recommend to you is that you start out learning the basic discipline of what makes a story. Because if you work in research, you rapidly discover the difference between a good question and a bad question. And a good question is the one that gets the revealing answer. Who would you say is the best interviewer you have seen working on television? Jeremy Paxman is very, very adversarial. I've been Paxmaned. He packs so many insults into his question that, for me, it made me giggle. I mean, it is a style. You know the famous interview he did with Michael Howard, then Home Secretary, when he asked the same question 12 times? Do you know about that? It was a situation in which Michael Howard had accepted the resignation of somebody who was in charge of the prison service in the Home Office. And I believe the question was along the lines of, if he had not resigned Secretary of State, would you have said you would overrule him? And there's a really interesting Radio 4 program about that. And what Michael Howard said was, I'd had a very long day. I hadn't read my papers before I came to this interview. I should have, and I didn't. He was talking about an event which had happened some time previously, and I couldn't remember. I could not remember what the answer to the question was. So he never answered it. He did the politician thing of answering the question next door to it, or inventing some hypothetical question he'd not been asked, and answering that instead. And they were underrunning. And in Jeremy Paxman's earpiece came the instruction, ask him again. Ask him again. So he asked that question 12 times, and he got a BAFTA. He got a British Academy Award that year. And it became the style, and you will now hear adversarial interviewers putting the same question over and over and over again. As a viewer and a listener, I find it extremely annoying, but that's just me. Because I think you make your point the first 3 times you put the question. Basically, what you're saying is, you haven't answered the question. So I respect Jeremy enormously. And he is the leading proponent of the Humphrey School of Interviewing. But I wouldn't have answered the question that way. Has anybody else got any particular interviewers that they admire?
Michael Parkinson.
Michael Parkinson. Michael Parkinson is not adversarial, but he's really interesting. I've been Parkinsoned. Really interesting. He's not a pushover. When a famous star dies, you will find that the BBC always, and actually ITV2, always pull out a Parkinson quote. A quote from an interview that that star has given Parkinson, because those were extraordinary examples of the comedian at his funniest. Billy Connolly owes his whole career to one interview he did on Parkinson. Or it's revealing, but it's still not the answer to my question that I would give. Anyone else?
David Frost.
David Frost. David Frost is fascinating. I've been frosted. David Frost is fascinating. Like all television performers, he has a healthy ego, but at the same time, he does homework like no other interviewer I know. And if he's got a big interview coming, he will ring up people who know that person, or people who know the world that person comes from, and ask them what they would ask. He's always searching for the best question. And he once said, and it's a cliche, forgive me, has become a cliche, he's once said, when the wind is cold, a man pull his overcoat tightly around him. When the sun shines, he takes his coat off. And that's the difference, because Paxman is a bitingly cold wind, and you huddle against it. But when Frost talks to you, David Merrill described him as beguiling. He gets politicians, he gets world leaders to take their coat off. And they will be, he used to do Breakfast with Frost on Sunday morning, always made headlines, always, because he got the most memorable quotes. Still not the answer to my question that I would give. Any other thoughts?
Sacha Baron Cohen.
It's a style. I don't think he invented it. I think Paul Hogan probably started in Australia. It's a style. And there are quite a lot of cod interviewers who lead you astray. I was talking about Chris Morris over supper tonight. I don't know if any of you have seen The Four Lions, have you? Extraordinary, extraordinary film. Extraordinary film. Brave, outrageous, touching, funny, extraordinary film. But Chris Morris started in television making cod documentaries, doing cod interviews. I'm not sure about it. I'm not sure about it, because I think it's a bit I think it's a bit unfair, you know, because he invites people in on one premise. Mind you, I mean, Tony Benn got away with it brilliantly, not knowing what the hell Sacha Baron Cohen was doing, and came out, you know, because he's so authentic, he's so genuine, that, you know, he just responded to this ridiculous person. Not you, you know what I mean. You were doing a little role play then. Yeah, he's very funny, very clever. Still not the answer I would make. I'll tell you the answer I would make, and it may or may not surprise you. Piers Morgan. Now, I cannot pretend to you that, you know, I think he's a shining saint. I cannot pretend to you that I know and love the man. I've met him twice. We exchanged very few words. His record on Fleet Street is idiosyncratic. But he has a way of interviewing people who we think we're so familiar with. We've seen them a million times, and he shows them to you in 3 dimensions in a way you've never seen before. So I'm not sure how fanatically you are attached to popular television, but Susan Boyle he interviewed in a way that enabled her to reveal more about herself and how badly bullied she was at school. Really moving interview. And now he's gone off. I mean, CNN have seen this skill and have grabbed him to be Larry King, and which is the plum interviewing job on American television. And whether he'll survive or not, who knows, because it's a tough element to try and swim in, the American television. But he's very sharp, very incisive, very empowering as an interviewer, so that he manages to combine the overcoat pulling round cold wind, because he's very sharp to the point, and the warmth that makes you take your coat off. Really interesting. And I learned about interviewing myself from being a researcher. So if you are interested in the media, whatever kind of media you're interested in, I recommend that you come in at a really, really junior dog's body level, because that's when you see how the skeleton of a story is put together. Okay? So I began as a researcher. I worked on the satire program for Ned, and then I worked on the consumer program with Bernard Braden. And the odd thing about that was that they put the researchers in vision. They put us on camera. My friend John Pittman and I were the 2 researchers, and we were both in the studio on Saturday nights. But we didn't take the performance side of it at all seriously, because we knew how expendable performers are on television. And it was for something of a shock that I then realized that I'd been appearing on television longer than I'd been researching or training as a director, which I also did. And then in 1973, the program called That's Life began. Now, That's Life started as a consumer program. A consumer program like Watchdog. People wrote in saying they'd been conned, or their car had fallen to bits, or whatever it was. We researched it, and we put the results of our investigation on the air. And what made it unusual in television, and consumer programs are unusual in this, is that it was all primary research. We were getting our journalistic stories directly, firsthand, from the people who'd experienced the con or bought the car. Most television journalism is second-hand. You read it on the news tapes, you read it on newspapers, you follow those leads, you invite that person in because you read about them. But in this, in consumer television, you have to go into the streets, the homes, you have to go undercover, you have to use hidden cameras. We had some of the first hidden cameras in television. They were enormous. We were exposing double glazing salesmen. And whereas now, that centre could quite easily be a camera. You do not have to have microphones as big as that. You can have cameras and microphones hidden in a fountain pen, if you know what a fountain pen is. I'm not being patronizing, I'm being elderly. I'm being reverse ageist, if you know what I mean. But you can hide mics and cameras anywhere. In those days, in one house where the salesman was going to go round every room, we built a cupboard. It was bloody crowded in there. There was the cameraman, the assistant cameraman, the sound man, and me in the cupboard. Not in the closet, you understand. And eventually we burst out of the cupboard, and the double glazing salesman looked at me, recognized me, saw the camera, and said, "Oh yes, I always watch your program," which was an unusual response, but it shows that everybody wants to be on television, or many people want to be on television, even double glazing salesmen. And in the other instance, we had to build a hut behind a house, which we pushed right up against the window we were going to film through. And one of the tenants from upstairs came down and complained that we hadn't got planning permission. And our director said, "It's all right, love, we're taking it down tomorrow." And she said, "Oh, fine," and walked in, not asking why or what you were doing putting a hut up for a night. Anyway, that, which now all the consumer programs do, is the most effective way of getting them bang to rights, because you cannot deny what you've been filmed saying. And that's why, for instance, Fergie, the Duchess of York, had nowhere to go when the News of the World, or whichever media it was, filmed her offering to sell the services of her husband, in a business sense, for money. I mean, when newspapers put hidden cameras on you, they've got you bound to rights. I don't know about the ethics of this, and I'd be interested to debate it with you. An ex-cabinet minister was talking to his girlfriend, who was not his wife, unaware that the man who owned the house in which she had a flat had an extension on her phone, and there was a tabloid journalist listening on the extension, recording it. So he lost his cabinet post, because there's no way he could deny what he and his girlfriend had said to each other. I don't know what I think about that, be interested to know what you think. So in this consumer program that went on for 21 years, we did all that sort of thing. But we did something else as well. One lunchtime, our production secretary took a call from a 22-year-old woman who had a 2-year-old son. She was called Debbie, son was called Ben, and he was dying of biliary atresia, which is a liver disease. And she had been told by his consultant, who worked at Addenbrooke's, that his only hope was a transplant. But she was also told that a transplant would be impossible, because Panorama had done a program saying that organs were being removed from living people, because they took cases from the States in which people who were in deep sedation, having taken drugs overdoses, were mistaken for corpses. It was thought that they were brain dead, and therefore their organs were used in transplantation. And that panorama frightened people so much that all transplantation stopped. But the British tests were different. However, it was too late. Transplant surgeons tried to get the BBC to make another program explaining that British tests were different. Didn't make any difference. So all transplantation stopped. So Debbie Hardwick said to Professor Khan at Addenbrooke's, how do I change public opinion? How can we start transplantation again? And he said very bravely, when you think what Panorama had done to his profession, television. So she rang us. I think she rang us on Wednesday. We sent a crew round that afternoon. In those days, a film, you had to process it overnight. We saw it on the Thursday and edited it. It was in the show that Sunday. Television being television, this 2-year-old who had enormous blue eyes and dark hair and was catching bubbles in his bath because I had a little boy of 2, and I knew that A, that would entrance him, and B, it would be a beautiful film. And he just won the hearts of the whole British public. And we then followed his progress, because that went out on Sunday night, and by the next Sunday we reported that he and his mum were at Addenbrooke's awaiting a transplant because a donor had been found. And we followed his story for a year, when alas he died. And he died because it was a new operation in this country, and the liver he was given was not a perfect match, and his heart gave out. And we set up a charity in his memory, a charity that still exists, which funded a paediatric intensive care bed in Addenbrooke's. But in the year of his life, he completely transformed transplantation. And suddenly donors were found, people were giving permission for their relatives to be used for transplant operations. The number of transplant operations more than doubled. So Debbie Hardwick and Ben Hardwick saved a lot of lives. Incidentally, the pendulum has swung back. It's now once again very difficult to find donors for transplantation. But there isn't a television program that can get 18 million now, except the X Factor finals, and I imagine the royal wedding. A good television audience now is 5 million, 6 million. And it really is different when everywhere you go there is somebody saying, did you see Ben Hardwick last week? Now, from that time on, we began to do life and death stories on this little consumer show. And we did stories about children's playgrounds. Nobody had been collecting statistics of the numbers of serious accidents that were being caused by the concrete surface, the tarmac surfaces on playgrounds, until we started to talk about it. And we showed on the air how a rubberized surface or wood chips actually mean that when a toddler falls from the first step of a slide, instead of fracturing her skull, she'll be fine. And over again, week after week, I took a china plate, not the same china plate, and dropped it first on a square of concrete and then on the rubberized surface to show it shattered on one and bounced on the other. And a campaigning member of Parliament once said to me that it's when you're really bored with the story that the audience is beginning to take the message. and parent-teachers associations around the country and so on began to insist that schools replace the surfaces on children's playgrounds. Once again, the pendulum has swung backwards, because what's happened now is some of these safe surfaces are wearing out, the concrete is showing through, and local authorities and schools are chaining up playgrounds rather than become liable for the injuries of children who fall on them, and rather than spend the money it would take to replace them, which is an argument for that's life, I suppose. We need perhaps another program that will do this sort of story, which is not really consumerism. And then in 1986, we did a story about child abuse. We had a lot of children in our audience because, for reasons that I'm prepared to develop, if you would like me to, we also had a talking dog, a cat that played table tennis, a man who tap danced with his false teeth, someone who played Amazing Grace on a forklift truck, some rather strange-shaped vegetables. We had all sorts of stuff in this really weird little collection of the serious and the less serious. The thing that united all the ingredients was that it all came from viewers, it all came from real life, which is why it was called That's Life. And because we had lots of kids watching us, I wondered whether there might be children who were suffering abuse who might need help, and we opened helplines. And in the 48 hours those helplines were open, they were jammed with children talking about abuse that they had never been able to tell anyone else about, because the last thing in the world they wanted was for the police to come in, for social services to come in. Some of them had been threatened that they wouldn't be believed. Some of them had been threatened that dad would go to jail, or that stepdad would kill mum, or that the puppy would be strangled, or the kitten would be drowned. They didn't want anything to happen to their family, but they felt they had to talk about their suffering. So we shut the lines down, because BBC is a broadcasting organisation, not a child abuse, child protection agency. And I walked round knowing that all those children had rung us during the hours that phone line was open, so how many more would want to ring if we had a telephone helpline for children that was open 24/7. And I talked about it to some colleagues, and they pulled together some experts from all sorts of child protection agencies and from government departments, all sorts. And they said two things. A, children would use it, and B, it would be impossible to create. So we went selectively deaf. BT gave us a simple number, 0800 1111, free phone number. And we launched ChildLine on a special program about child abuse 25 years ago. And I think I'm being commissioned to write a book about ChildLine. And I think that what the publishers, my meeting is tomorrow with the publishers, are going to ask me to do is base it on personal stories from people who have rung ChildLine through those 25 years. So if anybody falls into that category or knows someone who has, I need those stories, but I already have some. ChildLine now has 14 bases around the country. It's got around 1,500 volunteer counsellors. The lines are open 24/7, they're open now. We get calls from around 2,000 children a day. We answer around 2.5 million calls a year. The biggest, numerically the biggest problems are problems at home, family relationship problems and bullying, but also abuse, bereavement, pregnancy, children who've run away, drugs, alcohol, all sorts, the whole range you can think of. And I go around all our bases at least once a year, and I went round them all to celebrate our 24th birthday, and I was coming back in a train, second class, and I have a friend who travels first class, I travel second class, she's here, and there was a young woman at the end of the train compartment, and she had a pretty child. I smiled at her kid, and they both smiled back. And then towards the end of the journey, she suddenly rushed up to me and she pushed a letter into my hand. And it said, "Sorry to intrude, but I wanted to thank you. I didn't have a very rosy childhood. I faced poverty and sexual abuse and bullying. But I started to ring ChildLine, and those calls made all the difference. And that's why now I do a job helping children. And I wanted to make sure that you thank ChildLine for the help they gave me." So that's good, isn't it? Why an anonymous helpline with a counsellor that you can't see could give a child who has nothing else hope, which sees them through the most extraordinary suffering, I can't tell you. But I know that it can, and I know that sometimes it does. So, television can be a very, very powerful force for good. It can have really positive results, but it doesn't always. And I don't know what you think about television, and I don't know what you think about ways it's used, and I don't know what you think about ChildLine and any of the other topics that I've touched on today. But why don't I stop there, and why don't I pass it over to you, and you can talk to me about anything. Yes, madam.
I'm very thank you for such an interesting talk. Probably one of the main reasons why I came was I read that you founded ChildLine. I'm very interested in working with children. We had an amazing speaker last term who was running a charity helping children, and she was talking about the kind of, I suppose I'm interested in what your experiences on the kind of front line, because that's what sort of ChildLine must be like, about the kind of magnitude of the problem, because she said that there's something like an estimated 2 to 3 million children who are in real danger and need to go into care, and the social services really, really seriously need kind of reform in this kind of whole scope of problems. So I was wondering what you think about the kind of situation of children in need in different ways in England, and how, from your experience, what your ideas about how that could be.
So that was Camilla Batmangela, was it? Kids Company. She's amazing. 2 million children who need help, need support. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows, because certainly if you take sexual abuse, obviously this is a secret crime. The ChildLine is now part of the NSPCC, and the NSPCC has created a prevalence study. It's surveyed people to talk about what they've experienced in childhood, which may give us some idea how common abuse and neglect is. And that's going to be launched on February the 15th. So that may give one a sort of snapshot. ChildLine has just produced, it's about to publish, a case note which puts together the calls we've had from looked after children, which is the modern way of describing children in care or foster care. And it's not a very positive picture. Now, what I would say to you is that obviously the children who ring ChildLine are ringing for help, so these would be the children who are not happy. We do get calls from children who are ringing about another problem, who will incidentally say that they are in care and they are happy. But the fact is that care, the outcomes for children in care are not good by comparison with other children. So how we deal with that has varied from decade to decade. There have been times when people thought, well, in that case, since we know care is such a bad alternative, let's leave them at home as long as we can. And then you get a case like baby Peter Connolly, baby P, who was left at home and killed at home by his mother, who had been lying so fluently to social services and covering his wounds with chocolate. And I'm told by the policewoman who investigated the case that it was probably an hour to an hour and a half after he died that they called the paramedics in because they were trying to clear up the mess. So, how do we make that terrible judgment? How do we make that judgment? Well, with great difficulty, with training and understanding the risk. There's a risk if you take the child away from home. There's a risk if you leave some children at home. And for many people, the answer is we have somehow to detect these children at risk before they're born, because there are people who say the signs are there. And that if you support that family with skilled intervention, there is a window in time when people who have never experienced supportive parenting can be helped to put that good parenting into practice themselves. You can break that spiral. Who knows? Previous generations did it differently. You know, the orphanages, children's homes. Sometimes it worked brilliantly. Sometimes, as we know, there was abuse, there was suffering within those establishments. And I think the real tragic truth is that parents are not perfect. I remember saying to a child, she rang ChildLine, she was on her way to Piccadilly, she'd run away from home because she'd just discovered her own adoption papers. And she said, I now realize that my parents never loved me, they never told me the truth. I understand why there are no pictures of me as a baby with my parents. I've run away before, she said. I ran to Piccadilly before. I met a girl with a baby who was living there with a man, and he said that I could go and work for him. But the girl said I shouldn't. The girl said I should go home. So I did, but this time I'm away. So I said, why did you run away the first time? And she said, because I've never been able to talk about anything that mattered with my parents. And I could understand if they had that huge secret, I could see that there would be barriers. So I said to her, you've got to forgive your parents. My children have to forgive me. Part of a job of a kid is to forgive parents. They're not going to get it right every time. No one's expecting a parent to be perfect. But there is a level of knowing in your heart that you're precious to someone that we all need. Now the funny thing is, there's been Japanese research that says that doesn't have to be a member of your own family. It doesn't have to be your parents. It doesn't have to be your grandparents. It can be a neighbour. It can be the parent of a school friend. It can be ChildLine. But if someone cares and notices whether you do well or badly, that can make a difference to your self-esteem That can give you the basis for hope. And that, in its turn, may mean that you can give that to your own kids. I don't think I answered your question.
I think that does.
But we do hear from very lonely children. Very lonely children. I was listening to a call that came in last week from a 19-year-old. Officially, we're only for children up to 18, but this was a 19-year-old whose mum had said the most terrible, lethal, venomous things to her all her life. Most recently, sitting on her bed on Christmas Day and saying, I hope you get raped. Now there is that loneliness in that kid meant that all she could do was weep and describe it to an anonymous ChildLine counsellor. But that conversation meant somebody cared about her. And by the time I was listening to the call, she was beginning to thank the counsellor. Not because the counsellor had said anything that could change her situation, but because the counsellor had made it quite clear that we cared about her. And so often that's the element that's missing in these children's lives. And the trouble with the social worker is, I remember watching a documentary in which a kid said to the director of social services, in all my life, I cannot remember anyone ever saying they love me. And the director of social services said, love's a very precious word. But the trouble with being a social worker is, it's very difficult to tell a child you love them. Because you've got professional boundaries. Sir?
Could you just tell us why you ran for election last year, briefly, in a nutshell?
Very good question. The worst possible reason. I got angry. Never do anything because you're angry. Sleep on it. And if that doesn't do any good, sleep on it for a year. I cannot tell you how much that decision cost me. I got angry with Margaret Moran. Margaret Moran was Labour MP for Luton South, and she is the one that charged me, £25,000 to get the dry rock put right in her home in Southampton. I have a home near Southampton. I know how far it is, both from Westminster and Luton South. I cannot for the life of me see why 100 miles away the dry rot has any relevance to the work she was being paid to do. However, that's what she did. And when I went to Luton at the behest of a television crew who said, because I had expressed myself in writing, said, I think this is so outrageous. People in Luton were saying to me, we never see her. When we ring her up and ask for help, she never sees us. She never answers our letters, she never answers our emails, we can't talk to her. We feel that nobody cares. So I thought, well, this is very anger-making. Now, I was told that there's not a hope in hell for an independent MP to get in at a general election. It just does not happen. And that's without the leadership debates. And the leadership debates were brilliant, weren't they? Made you wonder why on earth we hadn't done it years ago. And when you saw them, you were really choosing between prime ministers, in a way, weren't you? You were thinking, who do I trust from this bunch? And the answer was, he's tired, and those two between them might get it right. Put them together. I think we've got a very sophisticated electorate, in my view. Anyway, but for a year, I spent 80% of my time in Luton South, and then lost my deposit. There's no fool like an old fool. So I did it because I was angry, and then I did it because I'm fascinated by politics and I wanted to see how the process works. And then I did it because I got terribly fond of Luton, where I'm going again this week. And do I regret it? Not really, no. I don't regret doing Strictly Come Dancing. I don't regret I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. I don't regret Luton South. Because when you get to a certain stage in your life, I imagine that you've got infinite time to do all the things you want. I mean, I've always used to say, in my next life, I'm going to do this. Well, I've actually had to come to terms with the fact that if I don't do it now, when am I going to do it? Hillel said 2,000 years ago, if I'm not for me, who will be? If I'm only for me, what am I? If not now, when? So I'm in the if not now, when stage. Then, would I do it again? No. Sir.
Well, Staff, I'd just like to make a response to your comment about not doing anything when you're angry. Just over 4 years ago, I got angry with the people I was working for, and I gave in my notice and I retired. It was one of the smartest things I ever did. However, as regards your conversation, I'd like to open the debate that you suggested about the question of journalists, to both television and press, recording people when they don't know they're being recorded and catching them saying things that they probably shouldn't say. And I would like to ask your opinion on the following view that I have about it, which is that there's a difference between entrapment and catching somebody who's doing something bad anyway when they happen to be doing it. And that what you did on that slide, or at least what you described yourself as doing, you knew these double salesmen, glazing salesmen were up to no good, and you simply put a camera on them. Whereas if you, for example, send somebody to an MP pretending to be a constituent and get them to admit or say something unwise and record it, that's entrapment in a sense. You're deceiving somebody as to the nature of the transaction that's going on, rather than recording somebody doing something that they're doing to other people. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that's a reasonable distinction and that's the sort of thing that you should restrict journalists in?
Well, it is very interesting. Vince Cable, obviously, was a victim of a couple of Telegraph reporters, were they? Who ambled in and pretended to be constituents, and in fact were recording him saying rude things about various politicians. And Vince Cable is still in post. It was actually, wasn't it, he said the rudest things about Rupert Murdoch, and he's not now in the job that meant that he's got to make decisions. It's a very interesting case, isn't it? Because I think good has come out of it, in the sense that I think it's probably wise, given that he had this view of Rupert Murdoch, that someone more neutral should be taking the major decisions about whether or not Murdoch should be able to buy up the rest of B-Sky B. And they seem to be coming to an interesting compromise there. I mean, it's fascinating that Murdoch is considering giving up Sky News, which is really interesting. But Vince is still in post. Whereas people who are actually filmed committing a crime, if he'd actually been filmed saying something fraudulent, I think he would not be in post. So I suppose in an ideal world, none of us in this room do anything that we would mind being filmed. Just think about that for a minute. And I'm also thinking about it, and we don't like that idea, do we? So hopefully the world will not get to that stage. But you and I know that we are on CCTV a hell of a lot. Maybe our DNA is being stored somewhere. How do we feel about that? Me? I don't care. I'm happy. CCTV in public places, that's fine. If my DNA is being stored somewhere, that's also fine. If by chance I turn into a serial killer and this causes me to be arrested, convicted, good, I deserve it. In other words, I ain't got much to hide. But you see, I have a very defective sense of personal privacy, otherwise I wouldn't be in the job I am. You perhaps feel much more private about these things. You may feel the CCTV is intrusive, the police have no right to keep innocent people's blood on their files and so on. And I respect your right to feel that, but I just don't agree with you. Madam.
I'd like to ask you a question related to what you said about what you'll do in the next life, in a loose sense. Were you to give advice to somebody who's about to graduate, starting out, as it sounds similar to you in the sense that their primary motive in career, the primary aim is to promote positive change as well as good as possible. Would you say that media or politics, or some kind of combination of the two, is the most effective means of fulfilling that aim?
What a fascinating question. What journalism has given me is I have learnt how to research, not in the academic sense, but in the journalistic sense. I've been in towns and cities and the countryside. I've talked to people who've been bereaved, who've been involved in crime. I've been in prisons, in hospitals, in psychiatric hospitals. I've worked in charities. You know, it's given me that sort of experience, which I think is invaluable, whatever then you want to do. And then after that, I think politics is fantastic. But you do have to compromise a hell of a lot. You have to join a tribe. You have to agree to go along with what the tribe believes or says they believe. You have to dig yourself out of holes when Jeremy Paxman's after you. So there's a lot of compromises. I came out of my year in Luton with a very high regard for the two candidates for Labour and Tory. They were very clever people and they were committed and energetic. And I think there are a lot of really good people in politics. And I think that's why the expenses scandal was such a shame, because it tarnished the whole bunch. So I would say, don't go into politics too soon. Spend time, and I recommend journalism, but there are other ways in the voluntary sector as well, of discovering what those secret worlds are like and what it's really like to live in places which are hard to get into in any other way. But remember, MPs have surgeries and all sorts of people come to those surgeries. So it's a really interesting, if I had my life over again, I might do it more seriously.
We've just got time for one more question, so smile.
Well, I'll tell you what we'll do. All three of you will tell me your question, and I will answer all three of them in one answer. Does that work? So, sir?
We've done some work with NAGC, which is a children's charity.
Shout at me.
Having done some work with NAGC, a gifted children's charity,
Yeah.
I was wondering what your best advice would be to a child's charity trying to establish themselves nationally.
Okay, right, sir?
And how important or desirable do you think it is that women in the media are attractive?
Right. Sir?
I just want to say I do remember that time, and I have fond memories of your vegetables. I'd like to say that I think you would make a good MP, and if you had been elected last year, what causes would you actually champion in Parliament?
Well, that is the easiest question, because there are things that I think we need to change in the way we treat children, in the criminal justice system, looked after children, all sorts of things, bullied children. I'm pointing at my friend who travels first class only because Sir Richard Branson allows her to. She runs a fabulous Cambridge charity. It's a UK-wide charity, headquarters here, called Red Balloon for Bullied Children. So there's a whole lot of children's issues. I'm also interested in palliative care, the care of the dying. I'm also interested in care of the elderly, both within the NHS and outside. So social issues, you might say. That's what I would have been really interested by. I had a children's charity, a visionary woman, in my kitchen this morning asking me the same question. These are tough times, really tough times. I believe that what charities really need is a very strong group of trustees. What the Americans say about charitable trustees is they have to give, get, or get off. Because it's their job to make that charity survive financially, while the visionary who's inspired the charity gets on with creating the service. So you need to look at who is chairing your board. I would say optimum number is somewhere around 10 or 12. And you have to make sure that you've got a really strong skill set around that table. And then feed the media. Feed the media with case histories, with stories. Make sure that your client base is happy and able to talk publicly about the work. And if they can't, make sure that the people who work for your charity have got those skills. It's terribly important that people who appear in the media, whatever form that media is, are attractive. That is not, gentlemen, the same, excuse me, being sexist, as sexually attractive. The people that you want to listen to, whether it's David Attenborough, or Sister Wendy, or Judge Judy, or the Dog Whisperer, now I'm betraying my viewing habits. Simon Cowell is no oil painting. Cheryl Cole is. But you don't have to be beautiful. You do have to be attractive enough for people to want to hear how your sentence is going to end. So when I was auditioning people who were presenting That's Life, and they were all new to television, that was my litmus test. If you were standing in a bar and you were starting a story, would I move closer or further away? Do I want to be part of your gang of friends, or do I not? And basically that's it. If you're look at the example I always give is David Starkey. Now David Starkey, I've actually been to dinner with. My God, if he's belligerent on radio and television, you should see him in life. You probably know him, do you? Doesn't he work around here? Anyway, he's fantastically attractive. Not physically. But he's so dangerous that you can't wait to hear who he's going to insult and how. Unlike your good selves.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. I'm sure you all agree with me. And could you please give a hand for us?